Hey there, this is Natalie, and the Mushoku Tensei OVA, which is an unaired episode that was included on the Japanese Blu-ray release, is now out. Yesterday I released a video reading the chapter from the light novels that the OVA was based on, so if you want to know how it was in the source material, you can check that out. But in this video I want to give some further information about the new characters we saw in the OVA, as well as talk about one of the big changes that was made from the light novel, which was how Rijerd was included in the story for the OVA. When it comes to a spoiler warning, it's kind of hard to say whether you'll view what I'll be talking about here as a spoiler or not, given it will include part of the story that was skipped in the anime, where Therese, the knight Eris helps in the OVA, reappears. Because she's a character that will appear again much later in the series, what I'll be revealing about her is in some ways a spoiler, but the actual events I'll be talking about were changed for the anime, and took place before the end of the first season, so would probably count more as skipped content than spoilers. This isn't skipped content in the sense that it happened in the anime canon and we just weren't shown it either. Canonically, the change in the anime means that anime Rudius has not met Therese yet, and light novel Rudius has. But the information about her that we'd have from the light novel version, which is what I'll be discussing here, would still be true in either canon. There weren't a huge number of events that the Mushoku Tensei anime adaptation chose to skip, but this is probably the most noticeable one, and I'll talk about why I think it may have been cut later in the video. Still, I won't be talking about any future interactions in the series involving the new characters, so other than that stuff about Therese, there won't be anything that spoils later events. If you do want spoilers about these characters, or you aren't anime only, I do have a full character video about Cliff, which I'll link to on the end card, and some of Therese and the Blessed Child's later plot involvement is discussed in my spoiler video about what happens to Zenith Greyrat. So, the OVA starts with a brief stylized section that shows us the backstory of Cliff. The chapter the OVA is based on also starts with Cliff's backstory, so if you want to know what was being shown here in detail, check out my reading of the chapter. But essentially, it shows that he was adopted from an orphanage by a high-ranking member of the Millis Church, and thanks to his aptitude for magic, everyone around him praises him, and he's quite pleased with himself. Actually, at the end of the chapter, it is revealed that the man who adopted and raised Cliff is not only now the Pope of Millis, but is also his biological grandfather. This is why, as we see in the end of the OVA, the conflict that is alluded to throughout the episode between the Pope's faction, who support the rights of demon race people and other non-humans, and the Archbishop's faction, who do not, look like they're going to affect Cliff's future. In fact, to keep him safe after these events, his grandfather sends him away to study in another country. This story, as it is in the OVA, is actually quite an important hint at some of the things going on in the world of Mushoku Tensei. Though, because we see it from Eris's perspective, it initially seems like it's just an adventure for her and a moment of character growth as she fights against strong enemies on her own for the first time, and of course kills other humans for the first time. For Eris, this is just another adventure to add to her growing list of interesting experiences. She immediately forgets to even tell Rudius about it, because she sees that he's upset when she gets back to him. This story, of course, takes place on the day when Rudius was first reunited with Paul, which is why in both the light novels and the anime, it was told separately as an interlude chapter and then an OVA, rather than breaking up that important storyline with Rudy and Paul. But if we look at the situation that was happening as more than just Eris being a good member of Dead End and saving a kid, it does tell us a lot about the situation in Millis, and this is also quite interesting in terms of the eternally grey nature of just about everyone and everything in Mushoku Tensei. The Pope's pro-demon race faction, which we would normally be inclined to think of as the good guys, because the anti-demon race faction are the ones who impose discrimination against characters we know aren't subhuman or evil, like Regerd and Roxy, are shown to be sending assassins after the child Eris rescues. This is because she is a Miko, or blessed child, and is highly valued by the Archbishop's anti-demon race faction, and is someone that faction would like to have become the next pope. As we see from the scene with Cliff at the end, the assassins Eris killed were actually Cliff's instructors, so while Cliff is on the side that isn't trying to oppress the demon race people, the faction that raised him is willing to assassinate a child that poses a threat to their future power. Eris, who sees things in a pretty straightforward way, and also because of her admiration for Regerd, wants to uphold his principles of always defending children, doesn't consider any of the possible consequences, and just wants to save the Miko. But Cliff, who knows what's really going on here, is given a lot to think about from witnessing this situation. In fact, I think it was to really make the broader context of the assassination attempt more obvious in the OVA that Regerd was included in the story, where in the source material he's actually off doing something else when Eris goes goblin slaying. What Regerd was originally doing in the light novels ties into the skipped content I'll get to in just a minute. So with that whole subplot being dropped for the anime, the writers had Regerd with nothing he particularly has to be doing on this day, where Rudy gave them the day off. And it certainly makes sense for him to be using that time to tail Eris and make sure she's safe. But as well as allowing for some quiet characterization for Regerd and his relationship with Eris, plus just letting us see him again, they took the opportunity to have a brief extra scene with him and one of the assassins that explains more about the pro and anti-demon conflict, before showing too that Regerd won't stand for anyone harming kids, even if the cause is one that benefits him and his race directly. We also saw scenes of demon race people being treated unfairly and taken away by knights, as Eris made her way to the guild at the start. We were already aware that demon race people are discriminated against outside of the demon continent, because Roxy talks about this early in the season, and we saw the issues with Regerd getting passage on a ship. But this shows us that in Millis, it is something more systematic, and also something relevant to the plot of this episode specifically. I think including Regerd in the episode was a good choice then, but why was Regerd left without his own things to do on this free day in Milishon by the changes made to the anime? Well, in the anime, when Dead End leave Millis to continue their journey back to Eris's original home, we're told that they're able to cross on the ship because Paul gives them a letter of recommendation. This allows the story to move straight on to the next major event, which is rescuing Aisha and Lilia in the Sharon Kingdom. But, well, you might have wondered why, when demon race are so heavily discriminated against in Millis, and when Regerd had so much trouble getting a ship before, Paul's letter was enough for them to make this crossing with no issues. Paul is married to Zenith, though she's missing, and she is from a prominent noble family in Millis, but they don't really like Paul, and they're part of the anti-demon race faction, so it's a bit of a stretch that Paul would have enough clout that a letter from him would guarantee not just a demon race, but a spurred, safe and easy passage. And yes, this was a bit of a break in logic that was introduced in the anime, because actually in the source material, they did have quite a bit of trouble getting permission for Regerd to cross, and this is where Therese Latria, the knight from the OVA, came into the picture again. In the light novels, instead of a letter from Paul, Regerd has a letter of recommendation from an old friend, who is an important figure in Millis. Him visiting this person to get the letter was what Regerd was busy doing while Eris went goblin slaying, and so why he wasn't included in the original chapter, but was free for them to include in the OVA. Incidentally, the friend in question is called Galgard Nash Vennick, and he's the commissioner of the Missionary Knights, one of the 3 orders of knights in Milis. But at the border, Rijerd is questioned anyway by a fat and very anti-demon duke, who doesn't believe that the letter is genuine. Rudius tries to do a bit of the old blag, using his and Eris's status as members of the Grey Rat line, and after some fairly comical arguments about the Duke thinking Paul is a lecherous little thug, he relents and says that Rudius and Eris may travel, but not Rijerd. Rudius doesn't know quite what to do here, but then the questioning is interrupted by a woman, who is asking if Dead End Rijerd is in the room. Rudius is taken aback, because as he looks at her, he's convinced it's his mother Zenith. But it's not Zenith, it is Therese, the knight from the OVA, and the reason she looks so much like Zenith is she's her sister, and Rudius's aunt. She's asking for Dead End Rijerd because that was the name Eris gave her. It's actually Eris she'd heard was in the customs building and wanted to find. It seems that Therese has been demoted following the assassination attempt because all of her unit were killed before Eris got there, and she's going to be working here, but she still seems to Rudius to have about equal authority to the Duke who's questioning them. When she asks who Rudius's mother and father are, confirming that he is her sister's son, Therese hugs him and tells the Duke that she'll take the 3 of them under her personal protection. The Duke pretty much gives up here, and Rudius and Therese, who is very much the touchy-feely type of aunt, spend some time together talking before Dead End board the ship, which is where Rudius learns what happened the day Eris went goblin slaying for himself. Hopefully you can now see what I mean about it being difficult to say whether some might view this as spoilers, because while this meeting between Therese and Rudius simply isn't canon in the anime, so just counts as skipped content, the fact that Therese is Zenith's sister and Eris now has some history with her still is in the anime canon, so this will be something that Rudius will now find out about later in the anime. I would imagine the reason it was skipped was simply to get to the next part of the story without a diversion that really only serves to introduce a character who won't appear again until much later. I don't know how many episodes each season will have or how much of the source material each season will cover, so it's hard to say exactly, but it certainly won't be in season 2. It's also necessary to know what happened in the Eris Goblin Slayer episode for the Therese scenes to make sense, and if they had already decided to do that chapter as an OVA released after the season, then that would also be a reason to skip this part. Personally, I think it might have been better if they'd aired the Eris Goblin Slayer episode after they left Paul, and then shown the Therese stuff in the following episode, instead of that whole episode about Roxy reuniting with her family. They then could have made the Roxy episode the OVA, since the stuff in the Roxy episode didn't really have any impact on what it would make sense to show next. I think this would also have been good because the Eris OVA really gives us a lot of insight into how Eris feels about Rudius, which would have perhaps had more impact to see before the events between them at the end of the season. But to do it the way I'm suggesting would have meant making season 1 part 2 a whole episode longer, so there are probably plenty of reasons why this was done instead. It doesn't have a huge impact on things, as Therese's relationship to Rudius can just be established later when she's relevant to the plot again. So, other than introducing a bit of a plot hole in terms of them being able to cross with no issues just from a letter from Paul, it isn't a big deal. But I can see why, compared with some other skipped scenes from the light novel, this is one a lot of fans felt caused some problems. But what did you think of the OVA? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to check out my video about Cliff and my reading of the light novel chapter if you want more content related to this special Mushoku Tensei episode. As always, thank you to my supporters on Patreon and to everyone who helps me out by subscribing to my channel and watching my videos. Thank you for watching this one, and I hope to see you again very soon.